Good morning. Micah 6:8 says, it asks a question of us. It says, what does God require of you but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And I've been sensing a general feeling of guilt in the church, and it's this feeling of guilt that it seems that we feel guilty about the situation that we see, and we see injustice in the world, and we feel a guilt about the injustice in the world. And it's almost like we stop there and we just see, it's like we want to identify with the sin, and we call it sin, and we say, whether it's a sin of racism or another type of partiality in our hearts, or there's a sin of lust, or a sin of pride or arrogance, or any other type of sin. We look at this and we say, here is the sin in my life, and we identify with that, and we say, I'm guilty, and we want other people to raise their hand and say, I'm guilty too, and then we stop. We stop there, and that's not what God requires of us. God doesn't require us to simply feel guilty. Guilt is not a solution. Guilt is not it's not anything that results in healing. Guilt is a starting point. Guilt is a recognition of a problem, and it needs to prompt us into action. God calls us to do justice. God requires us to do justice. And that word do, that's the same word that's used in Genesis 1 when it says God made the heavens and the earth. God created the heavens and the earth. So where there was no heaven or earth, God made the heaven and the earth. He created this. So when we see injustice in our world, when we see, and that word justice has the idea of people being treated equitably, people being treated on a level playing field, that every person is created in the image of God and they're treated that way. If we see that there's people who are treated unjustly, we are required to create justice where there was injustice. We are required to make sure people are being treated equitably and fairly, especially where we see they are not being treated equitably or fairly. And this all, if we focus on the guilt, then it becomes about us. If I see sin in my life and I just focus on the sin in my life, it becomes about that sin, and it becomes about me, and it becomes something that's self-centered, instead of looking at how I can be part of the solution. Not just focusing on how, here's this problem, but what can I do to be part of the solution? Guilt is not any kind of solution. Imagine if you were in a courtroom and somebody, the judge said, guilty, here's the verdict, it's guilty, and everybody says like, yeah, it's guilty, that's the right verdict, that person's guilty. and then nothing happened. Guilt is not something that is a solution. It's a starting point. It's a recognition of a problem, and it should prompt us into action. It leads to something. It leads to, in the court case example, it leads to either a fine that needs to be paid. It leads to time served in prison. It leads to community service. In other cases, it leads to some type of sentence being carried out. So when you and I see injustice in our world, and we see oppression, and we see any kind of injustice, our response should not be to focus on guilt and say, yes, there's a problem, and then we're done. That's not good enough. Our response shouldn't be to zoom out and say, here's this specific case of injustice that we see in our world, that you see in your world, that I see in my world, in my community, and I either come across this injustice, or this injustice comes across me, and I see this, and I want to zoom out and say, well, here's the specific case, and I zoom out to a big general case, and I say there's a lot of injustice in the world. I can't fix all the problems in the world, so it leads me away from doing what I can to fix the injustice that's in front of me. If I zoom out, I shouldn't do that. If I pan away, I shouldn't do that either. If somebody comes to me, or I see some type of oppression or injustice, and somebody comes to me with that, and I distract them from that issue by saying, yeah, well, you're telling me about this injustice. Do you know about all the injustice over here? And I pan away and I say, well, what about all that injustice? Or do you know about the injustice in my life? You see how I've made it about something else? I've made it about me, or I've not even listened to who this person is and what they're saying. I have completely dismissed it, and I have made it about me. And I made it about who I am outside of Christ. Galatians 2:20 says, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So if I want to focus on sin in a way that I identify with the sin in my life, that takes away from what God requires of me and what He's called me to do. He's called me in Christ to fix injustice in my community. He's called me to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly. I am called to, in Christ, see every person as created in the image of God, and to treat them that way, and to fight against areas where I see people are not treated that way. What is God required of us? To do justice. Where can you and where can I see and notice injustice in my heart or in our community? And where do we fight against that to make or create justice where there was injustice?